everyone. I'm just blown away by the turnout. I'm just so honored to have you guys here, so thank you. I also wanted to thank Kat, who agreed to be part of this show. We both have a history of paper dolls together, and Kat's work is just so fun and sassy, and I'm just so glad we did this together. Thank you. And Abby, thank you for hosting us, for being the best curator ever, for just being such a pleasure to work with. And for those who don't know, she is an amazing asset to our artist community. And she's an artist, so please see her work right next door in G44, right after our talk. So now I just wanted to turn it, one last thing. Karen, who wrote the poems, Karen Stuth, amazing poet. And she really got inside my head. I don't know how she did it. But she saw the pieces first and then wrote the poems. And unfortunately, she couldn't be here tonight because she is a town councilwoman for Palmer Lake. And they had an impromptu budget workshop, I guess, tonight, so she couldn't be here. So I'm going to turn it over to Kat, okay?
So we're each going to talk briefly about what we do, and then we're each going to take one of our pieces and tell you where it came from. So we're going to move quickly through this. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Abby. I mean, this is the gallery in which to be in Colorado Springs, and it's just a joy. And I'm here with my hero. I have loved Mattie's work forever. I love her work, and to think that she would invite me to be in her show is a little pinch me. But I lived with an artist for 17 years, Bill Burgess, and he was a real artist, you know, in my mind. He was trained, he was the artist. And so our house smelled like steel, welded steel, oil. There was art going on all the time, and I had a little corner in the house. Phil, I love peeking through the skirt. It's like a paper doll. So there's an endowment at UCCS where money is given each year to an artist. And I went to the first artist talk, and it was Vaddis Turner, and she was out of Nashville. And I went to her lecture, and she said, if you want to know, so I'm just sitting there naively, sitting there, and she said, if you want to know what your art is, look at what you did when you were a child, 8, 9, and 10. That's where your art is. So I went home, and there was a suitcase. I don't keep anything. I just get rid of everything. But there was a suitcase on the shelf full of paper dolls from my childhood. Elizabeth Taylor, Natalie Wood, Kim Novak, Giselle McKenzie, Marilyn Monroe, and it was like, oh my gosh. And in that suitcase, there are magazines where I created closets full of clothes that I had designed for my paper dolls. And this little suitcase is a spotted black and white suitcase that we named Donut when I was a kid because it was purchased at Kresge's or something. It was right next to the donut machine. So it has a smell to it too that was just so important. So I opened Donut, and there are these paper dolls, and I think, goodness, I have been drawing women and women's clothing. I want to thank the artists in this community that have been part of my experimenting with art. Gwen Fox, Sarah Housen, Lance Green, and all of the classes that I took, it was always about drawing women and their clothing and their movements. And it's like, oh my gosh. So I just started playing, and I had an old magazine, Art Deco, and I started putting paper dolls on that. And then my friend Meg Kendalls, who's here, gave me magazines from her mother's collection, which were just all of these old magazines of the past. And I just started going upstairs during COVID and putting paper dolls. And so I would go to fabrics, to papers, to Vogue magazine, and playing paper dolls again like I did when I was a kid. There was no thought about making art. There was no thought about measuring how good this is. which I tended to do when I lived with an artist, because there is a how good is this. Not that he ever judged that. There was complete freedom, but in my own mind, there was judgment. So I started playing with this, and then, oh my gosh, Mattie comes along. I bought a couple pieces of hers. She came to help me install it. She went into my studio and she said, oh my God, these are wonderful. Do you want to be in the show with me? Oh my God. So here I am. Once again, pinch me. And then Wendy Mike, who's here, I have loved her work. I have one of her bodies floating over my bathroom sink. And then Jane Gumfer calls or texts me and says, hey, I love your work. And so the reinforcement that my paper dolls are going big time. It's very badass, very badass. So that's kind of the background. I went to college wanting to be a fashion designer, and then the University of Iowa was so far out, it was so radical that art was, I dropped it and went into psychology, and so I sell real estate a little bit, and this is where I have the most fun. So that's my story.
So unlike Marissa, I have not been an artist my whole life. I have a checkered past, actually, to be an artist. It started out well, and it's ending well, and in between, there was a 40-year hiatus. So when I was little, my mom was an artist, and we used to sit at the little tea table and make art, and she became my first grade art teacher. And she could illustrate on the spot, a story. And she was really pretty, and all the boys loved her, and I was just so proud of her. And then when I was 6, she was taken away in an ambulance and disappeared for 6 months. She suffered from mental illness. And so I associated creating art with being crazy. So I stayed away for 40 years. I want to do a little sidetrack here, and that is, in honor of my mother, each year, I donate 10% of the revenue or proceeds from my sales of my art and my jewelry to NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, on the Colorado Springs branch. So I would encourage you to investigate that. They provide support for caregivers and for those that suffer from mental illness. So my mom was gone, and now my dad took over. And he was a chemical engineer, and couldn't have been more opposite. And so we would sit out on the front door stoop, and I would recite my multiplication tables and the chemical formulas for making sulfuric acid, H2SO4. And as I got older, it was more about logic and the art of argument. And inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, and is it any mystery I became an engineer and ultimately a lawyer? So you'll see the engineering certainly in my mobiles, but there's lots of engineering that goes into these larger, especially sculptures. And you will see the overly detailed mind of a lawyer in much of the detail work in my sculptures. So my background definitely has an influence. I finished out my career as an environmental attorney for Colorado Springs Utilities. And the general counsel's wife invited me to take a class with her called The Artist's Way. And maybe some of you have read the book, The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, and it's about accessing your creativity. So after that class, this 10-week class, I signed up for my first art class. I was 45 years old, and it was a figure drawing class with Sparky Leopold. And I carried on from there doing two-dimensional work, painting with watercolors and acrylics. I decided to retire from being a lawyer at age 50 and have not looked back. So for about 10 years, I was a painter. And I kept wanting to stick stuff on the, on the paper. So I was sent to Gwen Fox's class. I know many of you have taken classes in common history. And one of her techniques was using tissue paper on, as a collage element using acrylic medium. Well, I took that and put it on steroids and made it a 3D event. So it was basically glorified paper mache. And I first started doing cow skulls. And in fact, if Audrey's still here, she uses my cow skulls in her Georgia O'Keeffe talks. And I painted on them, still using my painting skills. So over the course of 10 years, I discovered 3 themes in my work. And one was botanical. And if you look around, you'll see a lot of botanical in the kimono, in my work. Also women, they just kept showing up. And finally, beauty became a very important element for me in my work. So as you look around, you'll see most of my works are beautiful. I don't gravitate towards the ugly. The other huge influence besides Gwen was a woman named Helen Hebert. She was she's an internationally renowned paper artist. And she has her studio in Redcliffe. And I went for a week-long workshop thinking I was going to learn how to make paper lanterns and books. And she says, oh, by the way, in my downstairs studio, I make paper using Abaca. Well, for the last 4 days of that class, that's where I stayed. I don't know how to make a paper lantern. Abaca is a paper pulp that's derived from a tree that grows in Philippines and some places in Central America. It's super high shrinkage fiber, very long fibers, and it's incredibly strong and incredibly unpredictable. So when I was in her little downstairs basement studio, I started making these little dresses, and I hung them up on with really teeny closed pins on these lines, and that's where it all started. So Abaca became my medium, my favorite medium, and it can be incredibly strong. So it can be the structure of a piece. So the porcupine piece here, this is Kiki's social distancing dress. Kiki is my mannequin. They have personalities, I love them. And so this was built on Kiki. And so the structure is actually paper. And you couldn't tear it if you tried. And sometimes it's what holds together a piece. So the Kiki sold seeds of gold dress. I wound that, brass wire for 60 hours on her and cut it off and then, tied it back together. And what's holding its shape is not the wire. It just kind of flopped all over the place. What's holding its shape is the Abaca. So I really like the idea of something that we consider so fragile, paper, as being the structure and the strength. So why paper dolls? Well, all my work is kind of paper, and when I was, a teen, 20s, 30s, I was really skinny. And I just couldn't wear anything in the stores, and I couldn't even sew my own clothes from like a Butterick or Simplicity pattern because I was just too dang skinny. So I had to design my own clothes. And I started noticing that I could design an identity. So I was one of those kids in high school, so I could cross groups, right? I could hang out with the jocks, I could hang out with the hippies, and so I could design a clothing piece for where I was going and who I wanted to be that day. And so that's part of what you see reflected in here. Some of these pieces have more than one dimension. Aren't we all multi-dimensional? So like Kiki's armored kimono, we see a strength there, and yet we think of the delicacy of flowers. And I wanted to capture that all of us, you know, have all of that going on. We can be both fragile and strong at the same time. And so that's in part what this piece is about. So what's the deal with the badass? Well, when Kat and I got together, we were like, so we both like paper dolls, but now what? And we went through a couple of themes, I guess, and finally settled on badass because it seemed to be a bigger umbrella that could cover more types of women. And so give me some examples of people, you know, of women you think are badass. Shout out some names.
Lady Gaga.
Lady Gaga, I love it.
Annie Lennox.
Annie Lennox, okay.
Michelle Obama.
Michelle Obama. I asked this question for about 1.5 years of people, and many of you heard this question. And I got things ranging from Eleanor Roosevelt to Dora the Explorer. Candace Owens to Hillary Clinton. Madame Curie. You know, Hedy Lamarr, Cardi B.
Oh, yeah.
And the answer that I got when people, you know, ripped through a couple of 2, 3, 4 famous people, often came back to my mother. People thought their mothers were badass. And that really said a lot to me personally. And so I started thinking about, well, aren't we all badass? You know, yes, thank you. We are really all badass. We may not be badass all the time. We may be badass for moments at a time. We may be badass for phases of our life. But we all experience being badass. So I came to the conclusion that if you gave birth and or raised children, you are badass. So that piece is right there. That's mother. If you overcame maybe trauma or difficulties in your life and you persevered and you came out still being a light to others, you're badass. So that is, where is she? Oh, she's right behind Kat here, spinning out joy. If you made some mistakes in your life, maybe really bad ones, I sure have, and you recovered, and you became a better, stronger, wiser person because of it, that is badass. So that is the do-over. If you have been hurt in love, as most of us have, and you still open your heart, that's badass. That's receiving. So the final theme is beauty. And I get together with Wendy and Sherry, usually once a month. I've fallen apart lately, sorry. And we talk about a lot of these things. And one of my concerns was maybe I'm hiding some difficult subjects behind beauty. So 2 pieces in here are definitely like that. One is Kiki sees a gold dress, and that involves all the ugliness of our politics. Politics can be personal. And I wanted to plant seeds of gold rather than seeds of hate. So that's what that piece is about. The piece in front of the window, the mobile, that is I was just goofing around making ball gowns, in my studio and thinking, oh, this is fun, I can make them look like foil, And I was listening to the Harvey Weinstein trial at that point in my studio. And so that's what that piece is about. It's called Candy Wrappers. So if you take a close look at it, not only is it beautiful, but it's a little bit disturbing. So I was very concerned about this, and I don't know, many of you probably know Tish Lacey Reed, another artist in town. I took a class from her way back when. She had a quote that I now have hanging in my studio, and it's kind of my mantra, and that is, beauty will save the world. And so both Kat and I committed to making beautiful things for this show. So I'm gonna give you guys an option. We can do one of two things. You can ask us questions if you like, or you can pick a piece of each of ours and we will talk about it. Whatever is your preference.
Can I interject? Because there's a piece behind Abby's head that to me speaks to what I would want to speak to. So can I not do it? Okay. That was just what you were going to ask about, right, Phil?
It was.
That's
Okay.
So let's go look at Kat's piece and she can talk about it.
all right. So when Mattie started talking about badass and what that means, then I started looking at what I've just been playing with, because mine truly was just playing paper dolls. But then seeing a theme that began to emerge from playing. And it was seeing where badass women step out of the story and the history of the past. Because there are rules, there are ways of being a woman that were what you could wear, how you could be. And to be a badass woman, you're brave enough to change the story. So in that piece, which those three women in that piece came from one of Meg's mother's magazines, and they're very judgmental women from the past. When I was growing up, my grandfather, whom I just adored, we couldn't cross our legs, we couldn't wear anything that showed our knees. In 5th grade, when I felt myself developing, I put a tight slip on so my grandfather wouldn't think I was ever going to have breasts, because I didn't think that would be So what I love is that my badass women are women that step out of history and reveal and celebrate and dress the way they want to and move the way they want to. And that's really a theme for me when I was a therapist working in women's groups, was who do we want to be outside how we're supposed to be? So for me, a badass woman lives her own truth. And that piece to me says it. So the name of that piece is Thy Will Be Done. She's revealing herself and in the face of judgment. So that's kind of a theme that I saw in hindsight, was something that kept appearing, was stepping out of the past. And in fact, my women are stepping out of the frames, so they are stepping out, which is part of the theme. So.
So, for my part, would you like to talk about a particular piece, or would you just like to ask some questions?
That piece. That piece.
This is the toughest one for me to talk about. So I make jewelry as well. And so my jewelry informs my art, informs my jewelry. It's kind of a flow back and forth. And this is the last piece I created for the show, and I barely got it done in time. And it's a little bit jury-rigged. Carl helped me jury-rig it onto the stand. So I'm a procrastinator. So this is perforated steel. And in January, I took a perforated steel jewelry, I should say steel jewelry class. And so I was making little pieces of jewelry, out of steel. And I thought, well, why not go big? And the truth was, I didn't have an idea for it. And usually I get my ideas, not meditation as Marissa does, but in that space between sleeping and waking. That's usually when I get my ideas. And nothing was coming up. I had this sheet of perforated steel laying around my garage. And in fact, when Abby came to visit, she saw it sitting there. And right next to my bike, I happen to be a cyclist as well. And I was pumping up my tires going, what am I gonna do with this piece of steel? And all of a sudden it hit me in a flash. And I was like, oh my God, I know what I'm gonna do. But like Marissa, sometimes the muse takes over.
Yeah.
So originally she was supposed to be black with very bright flowers, as her skirt. And I told all this to Abby. She's just seen this laying on my floor. And I gave her the name of the piece. It was going to be Out of Darkness. I knew what I was doing, except the muse arrived.
Yeah.
And suddenly it was a different piece. And even I do not fully understand why I created this piece. But I realized she had to be muted, that she had to be nuanced, that space between black and white, that space between sleeping and waking, that mystical, magical, beautiful space that we don't dwell in quite enough. That's as much as I can tell you about her, why she's a dear. I have no idea. When Karen was going to write the poem, and I was telling her about it, she said, well, you are regenerative. And perhaps that's what it's about, I don't know. Sometimes I find out a year or two later what a piece is about. In fact, the piece that Kat owns is one of those pieces. So that's about as much as I can tell you about her. I don't know, but here she is.